I was just trying to do something simple that day, something every ordinary person does without giving it much thought. I had gone to the store to pick up groceries, thinking only about what I wanted to cook later, whether the produce looked fresh, and whether I had remembered everything on my list. It was not supposed to be an eventful trip. I pushed my cart down the aisles, checked the prices, picked out what looked best, and eventually stopped at the produce section to grab some tomatoes. That's when everything shifted. As I reached for them and placed them in my cart, a young man came up, and without hesitation or even a hint of courtesy, he snatched the tomatoes right out of my cart. At first I thought it might have been a mistake. Maybe he thought they were his. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. But the look in his eyes and the words that came out of his mouth erased any hope of misunderstanding. He looked straight at me and said, "People like you don't deserve these." The weight of those words sank in immediately. They weren't about tomatoes. They weren't about groceries. They were about me, about the color of my skin, about his perception of who I am, about his belief that I didn't belong, that I wasn't entitled to something as ordinary as fresh produce. I was stunned for a moment, but before I could respond, his mother appeared. She was a woman I recognized in passing, the president of the local HOA, someone who had a reputation in the community for being controlling, overbearing, and entitled. Instead of correcting her son or even asking what had happened, she immediately escalated the situation. She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and began shouting into the receiver. Her voice was loud enough that people nearby turned their heads. She declared that I was a threat, that she was in danger, and she demanded that police cars be dispatched immediately, not 1, not 2, but 20. She wanted an army of officers to descend on a grocery store because her son had stolen from my cart and hurled a racist insult at me. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. What she didn't know was that I am not just any man in that store. I am the police commander for this county. Every officer she was demanding, every cruiser she was trying to summon, every resource she was attempting to misuse, I command them. Her power play was built on lies, assumptions, and the expectation that the police could be weaponized to enforce her prejudice. But she had no idea she had aimed her false accusations at the very person responsible for leading law enforcement in her community. I stood there, calm, measured, and collected, because I knew that anger would only feed into the narrative she was trying to create. What she wanted was a scene, me raising my voice, me looking aggressive, me becoming the threat she was desperately trying to sell to the dispatcher. Instead, I kept my voice steady and my movements controlled. Witnesses were already watching. Cameras in the store were already recording. And the call itself, her frantic exaggerations, her baseless claims, would be documented, timestamped, and retrievable as evidence. Over the next several days, everything unraveled for her. The truth has a way of doing that. When we reviewed the surveillance footage from the store, it clearly showed her son grabbing the tomatoes out of my cart unprovoked. It showed her making the call. It showed me standing there, hands visible, calm, and entirely non-threatening. Several bystanders came forward with statements, saying they had heard her son's comment, that they had seen her escalation, and that they were disturbed by her attempt to twist the narrative. On top of that, additional information surfaced. Hidden cameras around the neighborhood, which had been installed by frustrated residents tired of petty vandalism, captured her involvement in damaging property, writing threatening notes, and enforcing her HOA power in ways that were both unlawful and unethical. What began as an attempt to humiliate me in a grocery store quickly grew into a reckoning for her entire pattern of behavior. At a community meeting called to address the incident, residents spoke up one after another. They described years of intimidation, arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of HOA rules, and behavior that crossed the line from strict to abusive. The meeting was recorded, and when clips made their way online, they spread rapidly. People were stunned not only by the blatant racism of the grocery store incident but also by the sheer arrogance of someone who thought she could bend the legal system to her will and then discovered she had aimed her abuse at the county's top law enforcement officer. The HOA board had no choice but to act. The evidence was undeniable. The pressure from residents was overwhelming. They stripped her of her title and authority, removing her from the position she had used for so long to impose her will on others. It was not revenge, it was accountability. She had tried to paint me as dangerous, as someone who needed to be controlled, as someone unworthy of dignity. Instead, she was revealed for what she truly was, someone willing to weaponize lies, prejudice, and emergency services against people she disliked. I chose not to let the story end quietly. Too many times, situations like this are buried, brushed aside, or explained away. Too often, the people on the receiving end of such abuse have no recourse, no platform, no badge or position to shield them from the fallout of a false report. But I do, and with that comes a responsibility. So I called a press conference. I laid out the timeline, the evidence, the recordings, and the statements. I made it clear that this was not about me seeking personal vindication but about demonstrating what happens when truth and accountability are allowed to prevail. I spoke about the misuse of 911, about the danger of false reports, about the corrosive effect of racism when it masquerades as concern for safety. She had tried to stage a story in which I was the aggressor. Instead, the real story became one of exposure, consequence, and community empowerment. The tomatoes that sparked it all were never really the point. The point was the principle that every person deserves fairness, dignity, and safety, whether in a grocery store or in their own neighborhood. And the woman who thought she could take that away from me ended up losing everything she had tried so desperately to control.